Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest Knoca workshop, this time on inclusion, diversity and disadvantage within climate assemblies. Just to let you know, we're recording, so the usual issues apply. If you are not keen on having yourself seen, then we understand why you might be behind, might have your camera off. But pleasure to see those people who are happy to have their camera on. This may seem like, in some ways, an odd workshop. After all, many advocates and practitioners of climate assemblies are attracted to this particular model because of its combination of sortition and learning, deliberation and recommendation writing that seem to embed a commitment to diverse, inclusive and equitable participation. But I think we always need to be vigilant with our practices to make sure actually that there are, to recognize that there are possibilities that even within those processes which are aiming to achieve inclusion and equity, that actually they may generate inequalities and disadvantages, either reinforcing what existing ones or generating new ones. So it's really important for us as people who are working in this field, I think, to constantly reflect critically on our own practice. That can be really challenging, and I think that's something we'll reflect on the next couple of hours. But it's necessary if we're going to better understand the potential and limits of climate assemblies. After all, I don't think any political institution, any participatory institution can be fully inclusive and can be fully equitable and can be fully diverse. So I think we need to recognize that there are limitations in all of our practices. So let me tell you a little bit about the background to today's workshop. So about 6 months ago, we provided small grants to support members of the Knoca community, consider ways in which inclusion and equity play out within climate assemblies. And we provided 2 grants, which we're going to be hearing from today. The first is that we supported the Global Assembly research team to undertake interviews with some of the assembly members from more socially and politically disadvantaged social groups to better understand their experience of engaging with this global deliberative endeavour. Now, we're talking about the Global Assembly, but we don't want to just say the Global Assembly is the only space that has these kind of issues are raised. In fact, one of the interesting things about looking at the Global Assembly is I think it opens up areas of our own practice that may have been overlooked. So this is not a call about the Global Assembly. We're just using the Global Assembly as an example. And we're really grateful to Claire Mellier from ISWE, which is the People Power Foundation, who is one of the co-initiators and co-organisers of the Global Assembly. She's going to provide a brief introduction into how the organiser tried to mitigate inequality and disadvantage in the governance and the design of the Assembly. And I'd like to thank Claire for being very open about the kinds of challenges that they faced. And then Azucena Moran from the research team will then highlight some of the dimensions of inequality and disadvantage that they discovered and emerged from the interviews they had with Assembly members. I apologise about my voice, by the way. I've just been getting over a virus, so I'm just only getting my voice back. The second grant went to Elodie Jacquet, who's the Knowledge and Practice Manager at the Wosk Centre for Dialogue at the Simon Fraser University, to write a short think piece on inclusion and equity in climate assemblies. She's going to present some of the insights from previous work that the centre's done around this issue, and use this workshop as a way of developing this think piece for Knoca. What we're going to do after the presentation, so there'll be a brief conversation between the presenters and myself, where we'll try and clarify some of the issues and try and respond to some of the questions that have been raised in the chat, if any have. I'm sure they will. And then in the second half, we're going to break out into smaller groups to discuss how we understand the potential for inequality and exclusion and a disadvantage that it may emerge within climate assemblies, and how we as practitioners and advocates and others might be able to respond to those challenges. So it's really a chance for us to reflect collectively and to think about how Knoca might take forward this agenda. So that's our program. That's our motivation for why we brought you here. I just want to, before we launch into the first presentation, I want to recognize that these issues can be challenging to our identity as practitioners, as researchers and advocates. And we really need to be sensitive and respectful to the views of others in this space. I know you're all really great people, but this is an area where tensions can emerge. And so I hope that we can create a space of sensitivity and a space of respectfulness to people who may have different positions to ourselves. If I could invite you at any point to put a comment or question in the chat, please do so. So without further ado, I'd like to turn initially to the Global Assembly. As I say, this isn't a call about the Global Assembly. We're just using it as an example. I've already introduced Claire from ISWI, the People Power Foundation. And after her short presentation, Azucena from the Research Institute for Sustainability will give us some of the insights that are coming out from the Global Assembly research team. So over to you, Claire. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. I'll start sharing my screen. Can you all see it?
Yeah. Yep, we can.
Great, thank you. So yes, I'll try in about 5 minutes to whiz through what we did at the Global Assembly. Oh, it's not sharing. That's exactly what I was expecting. Sorry about that. There we go. So just to be aware, we've got a report published on the Global Assembly report, and it's on the Global Assembly website. It's about 300 pages. So if you want more detail about what I'm going to try to cover, you can have a look at it on the website. It's globalassembly.org/report. So there were two key components I'd like to focus on here that will help me explain how we looked at inclusivity, accessibility, and equity with the Global Assembly in terms of the design, governance, and other aspects. So the core assembly was composed of 100 people initially, 98 by the end of the process. And it was a descriptive sample of the global population, representative by geography, gender, age, education, and attitude to climate change, chosen by civic lottery sortition. And it was the first time it was attempted at the global scale. And the assembly members met for 68 hours online across different time zones, and over 20 sessions for 12 weeks in total. These are some of the key demographics from the 100 assembly members. And just to highlight a few, you can see that 66% of them earn less than $10 a day. About 30% had limitations in terms of reading and writing. And they were 16 of them who considered themselves to belong to an indigenous community, and 6 of them were refugees or internally displaced. The second element I wanted to highlight was what we call the community assemblies, which were self-selective, self-organized group who followed a similar process to what the core assembly followed, but it was done at the local level, in person most of the time. And that was, in a way, our way to try to address the criticism that's often made against deliberative mini-publics, in the sense that they don't allow wider engagement from people who are not selected in the assemblies. So my key points in terms of this question of inclusivity, accessibility, and equity, and I've used Elodie's definition. Actually, Elodie will speak about that in her presentation in a moment, but I found them really helpful to help us reflect on how we try to do that with the Global Assembly. So in terms of inclusivity, inclusive means that it invites everyone who may be affected by a decision. How can you do that in the deliberative process? That's for me, that's one of the biggest challenge, and one, as I said, one of the criticisms of mini public is that that's a few lucky assembly members selected. So what we did was develop this option to have people initiating community assemblies and bringing basically the conversation beyond the walls of the core assembly, and what some people would say it could be described as scaling up deliberation, bringing it to a different level. In terms of accessibility, whether we can say everyone who is invited can participate fully in the process, I think it had different elements, but in terms of the logistics of the core assembly, we try to provide obviously translation through the community host. So each assembly member had the support from a community host who was acting as a companion and was supporting the assembly members through consecutive translation, but also was providing technical support with very practical aspects such as providing laptops, internet connections, because a large number of participants didn't have access to that, for instance, in their personal settings. And then we use different breakout groups to allow people to join the core assembly in suitable time zones. So the plenary sessions were on Saturdays, and that meant some people had to wake up really early, others had to go to bed very late to attend the sessions, but most of the breakouts were designed so that people could attend in more social, not antisocial timings. Key element, equal compensation. So all assembly members receive $600 for their participation in 68 hours of engagement. These, for me, will be interesting to unpack maybe in a moment, because I think it raises really interesting questions around the impact this could have on communities, actually in terms of equity and the risks associated with that. And finally, in terms of equity, and if we understand it as the aim is to actively acknowledge and address historic and ongoing disadvantage some groups may face, we try to do that by, for instance, in the governance, having representative from original nations and indigenous wisdom keepers included in the governance. We had two members who represented original nations in the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee. We had an approach to the delivery, which was decentralized. We had a global community of more than 400 individuals and at least 120 organizations across 112 countries, which delivered the Global Assembly. In terms of process design, there are different ways of learning that were acknowledged, but I think we are conscious that still the process that was designed was very written material heavy and not really suitable for some people. And that's what I think some of the research findings are starting to show in terms of the challenges and the limitation of the approach. So Azucena will tackle that, I'm sure, in a moment. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire. We're going to pass over straight away to Azucena to talk about some of the findings from the research.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you, Claire. I'm going to just quickly share my screen. Let me know if you at some point stop hearing me. But no, very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to go very quickly because I don't have much time, but I'd first like to acknowledge that this is a team effort led by Professor Nicole Curato together with Melissa Ross, Lucas Negri Veloso, and myself. But without further ado, let's get into it. So as we've heard also before, within deliberative democracy, you often think about the principle of equality as something to be operationalized, as something to be somehow designed around. And we often do that through, well, demographic representativeness or facilitated collective decision-making, or the empowerment of participants through different strategies. And of course, there are different limits to what, the way in which these design features are implemented, but I won't go into this today. I just put a brief example here. And what we do basically in the article is not look into this specific limits, but what we do in our research is basically try to understand the experiences of participants coming from the majority world in the Global Assembly. So basically how they actually experience these multiple design features and these multiple design tweaks that try to uphold both inclusiveness and equity. And what we found was basically that there were 4 different experiences of disadvantage present in climate assemblies, and in particular in the Global Assembly. So the first one is disadvantage as intersectional. I'm going to go into what that means to us a bit later. Disadvantage as contingent, disadvantage as an asymmetrical phenomenon, and disadvantage as unproblematized. And as Graham mentioned, our results are based on 10 in-depth interviews with participants from the majority world. So South America, Southeastern Africa, Central Africa, Southeast Asia, Southwestern Asia, East Asia, and South Asia. These were all made in the participants' first language. But let me delve into the results and a couple of points that I would like us to reflect on. The first is the understanding of disadvantage from the lenses of intersectionality, which somehow allows us to see how power relations intersect and overlap in between each other. So among assembly members, we often heard how their participation, and I think this is not going to be a surprise for you, was affected by an intersection of social markers, context, and everyday urgencies. But it wasn't only a question about how racial, gender, or income inequalities were somehow reproduced. It was also a question about how they intersected with violence, with lack of time, with digital inequalities, and with colonial structures. So as many climate assemblies, the Global Assembly was focused on designing procedural tweaks, as also Claire mentioned, that responded to certain social and economic markers. But somehow this approach fell short of addressing the intersecting conditions of disadvantage. Let me give you an example. So a participant from Central Africa who faced a lack of stable income, who survives on his agricultural activities and lives in a very insecure area, struggled to devote 4 hours a day to studying the informational materials for the assembly. He often couldn't commute to find a stable internet connection. So he was economically compensated to address the material disadvantages that he was facing. But for many of our interviewees in the majority world, economic compensation was not really a replacement of the work income, of their labor income. And it wasn't really a compensation for the potential loss of income in the long term. So the assembly becomes something they somehow do on top of their work time and on top of their normal lives, let's say. And they somehow carve out political time within their daily lives in a way that isn't really sustainable in the future. And I think here briefly mentioning, there are many feminist indigenous scholars who have long talked about collective action and participation as something that should be part of somehow what they call the reproduction of life. So, and as a sort of citizen engagement that is connected and embedded in care responsibilities, in spirituality, in the work for their private and collective spheres, in celebration. So they're really embedded in their daily lives. So about a process that aligns with everyday spaces and realities, so people can take part in it securely and comfortably. This takes us to this next point we'd like to make, which is that disadvantage is a dynamic and contingent experience. So scholars of disability studies, for example, have long told us that disability is somehow a way of being a minority. So it's a product of how structures minoritize and deter people with disabilities from taking part as equals in social life. And it works similarly in the Global Assembly. Some participants experience disadvantage because the ways the forum was designed didn't really align with their everyday realities. So somehow, if we think about the natural ground where we often build citizen assemblies or deliberative forums, the natural ground to build this is advantage or privilege. So somehow design tweaks are always aimed at supporting communities to fleetingly overcome political poverty and be able to occupy that space momentarily. But contingent forms of disadvantage, what they do is basically they allowed us to see how people were sometimes unable to reach temporarily that position of advantage, be that because of injustice or be that because of insecurity or dependencies between transport or digital inequalities. Let me give you another example. So we talked to a participant from Southwestern Asia. She worked in an international organization and had experience already engaging with civil society activities. She was very articulate, fluent in English, and very vocal over social media. So in her case, the online format of the Global Assembly put her at a disadvantage in a different way than we would have imagined. It wasn't really about lack of time. It wasn't about education inequalities. It wasn't about not being tech savvy. But she lived in a country that was still recovering from a recent history of violent conflict. And this meant limited power supply and limited internet connection. And there were several instances when she dropped out of the deliberations or had to miss sessions. So the experience of the disadvantage that she was facing was contingent on the design of the Global Assembly, that it took place online, that they'd require internet speed. But for others, their disadvantage was contingent on the fact that it took place in the evening, because evening was assumed to be working adults' free time. While for some, like we heard before, the evening entails curfews in conflict zones, precarity in travel conditions, and for others, joining from home meant somehow sidelining family and community obligations or even party obligations. This leads us to our third point I'd like to talk about, that is somehow the uneven consequences of disadvantage. So the experiences of disadvantage in the Global Assembly community were evidenced also by seeing like somehow the uneven distribution of not only financial costs, but also the personal social costs of participation. So a really, really common story in our interviews was how people tapped on their extended kinship care networks, their families, their neighbors, their communities. A young African Assembly member, for instance, confessed to feeling mentally lazy when he was reading the information packet because the text was too long and asked their mother for help. A retired woman from Latin America asked her nephew to explain the content of the booklet. A fisherman from Southeast Asia asked his wife to help him prepare for the assembly, and his son bought a generator for him to be so he was basically able to take part in the deliberations even when there were power interruptions. Some participants brought their families, their neighbors, and their friends to the screen during plenaries. So here, the question is, what does it mean for deliberative mini-publics to harness participants' collective wisdom? On the one hand, we could say that generating collective intelligence in this case goes beyond the person selected to participate. It is built on the goodwill of family and their extended networks of care. On the other hand, it seems to also shed a light on the uneven distribution of personal and social costs of participation. And especially when one doesn't consider that the engagement of their extended communities. So somehow, like, how do we somehow take this for granted? The fourth, which leads us to the fourth, which is the disadvantage as unproblematized. So members often normalize their own disadvantage. For instance, when talking about participants who dominate the conversation, they did not consider domination to be a problem. One participant from Latin America thought it was natural for more educated people to speak more. Several interviewees talked about English native speakers as active, straightforward, and bold. An interviewee from East Asia stated if it were in his language, they wouldn't be able to do it because who would translate, despite speaking one of the most spoken languages in the world? So most assembly members we interviewed hinted explicitly or implicitly a difference in status between them and other participants, and described their own role in the assembly as listening to and learning from these experienced people who were able to qualify to speak about the climate crisis. Several participants portrayed the role of their facilitator as a teacher or someone who explains concepts and ideas to them. So, and many also pointed at feelings of gratitude and the discomfort that they felt when there was a rare emergence of conflict. And there are various ways of interpreting this finding. On the one hand, one could argue that norms of deliberation were emphasizing respect and patience and conflict avoidance. And on the other, We could also think about whether we're understanding deliberative interaction not as a political event where somehow interests and worldviews can or must clash, but somehow as a form of educational training. And one possible way forward is to design citizen assemblies from the perspective of the most disadvantaged participants. So from the perspective of people in conflict zones, in regions where power interruption is in the norm rather than an exception, of participants who are time poor and have little agency to arrange their lives, of those with care responsibilities and personal and social commitments. And here we can draw inspiration from the advocacy of disability activists. So for instance, like if you put a ramp, it doesn't only help people with compromised mobility, it also helps people with bicycles, it also helps the elderly or young families with prams. So what would a citizen assembly look like if it were designed from the perspective of people in the most precarious conditions, not built on the grounds of privilege and advantage? Second, we advance a critical question of the extent to which designing democratic innovations can meaningfully address disadvantage. So is it about design or is it something deeper? Do we need to talk about decentering the epistemologies of deliberative democracy away from the tradition of Western European modernity? Third, taking the global assembly as an example, we could also talk about how to gear the design not only to address disadvantage, but also advantage. And finally, addressing inclusion within climate assemblies needs to perhaps emphasize not only political agency of citizens, but also political ownership. And I think this might entail questioning some of the dominant design features of mini publics. So our main argument here is that we need to go beyond static and singular categories of disadvantage. So it is key to establish somehow connection between multiple burdens and how they actually play out in citizen assemblies. And I think this seriously implies considering the implications of those burdens and the necessity to distribute convening and economic power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Azucena, and thank you, Claire, for the introduction to what it was that the organisers had been trying to do in relation to dealing with the disadvantage and inclusion. Now, I said that's a very specific example from the Global Assembly. There are certain aspects, I think, of the Global Assembly experience that are specific to a transnational assembly, but I also think there are reflections of what Claire and Azucena were talking about, which are absolutely relevant to national and local assemblies happening across Europe. So I think one of the interesting things will be to pull out those connections. So thank you for that. What I'd like to do now is to pass over to Elodie, who is actually taking this kind of broader perspective across assemblies and is from the Simon Fraser University Maurice J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue. And she's going to introduce us to some of their thinking from the centre around questions of inclusion and equity. So over to you, Elodie.
Thank you, Graham. And it's such a pleasure to be here among many practitioners. I'm just going to share my screen here so we can get started. So as Graham mentioned, I'm with the Maurice J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue. We're located in Vancouver, which is on Indigenous lands. So I'm going to just take a second to acknowledge that I'm currently on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And a lot of their thinking informs how we think about this idea of equity, diversity, inclusion, and respect, in a sense, for all the identities present in any assembly. So the Centre for Dialogue is really a practitioner-based center. We have a small claim to fame that we hosted the very first Citizens Assembly in Canada on electoral reform in this very room that you see here on the screen. So we do design and implementation of deliberative spaces, but we also do a little bit of teaching around dialogue and public engagement. So how did we come to discussing equity and justice? A couple of years ago, we were asked to do a bit of work on these very questions in the broader context of public engagement more generally, and then started focusing more a little bit on climate assemblies in the past year. So I'm going to go very quickly through some key concepts. One thing that I want to mention to folks is that really all of this is contextual. So the Global Assembly is a good example because it demonstrates that context is very, very important when you think about equity, inclusion, diversity, or justice. And the approach we took at the center is to use principles rather than prescriptions, because each context will require a different set of things. And again, to pick up on what Azucena was saying, we might want to think of these as how can we universally design, but also be very specific when needed. So a couple of things, I like that Claire mentioned our definitions, but deliberative spaces are inclusive if they invite everybody affected by a decision, accessible if everybody can participate in the decision. And again, as Azucena mentioned, some of the challenges around that participation. And it is equitable if it actively acknowledges and addresses historic and ongoing disadvantages some groups may face. In the context of climate assemblies, this is very important because we know climate doesn't affect everyone in the same way. If I take the example of a city, for example, if you have important climate risks, they won't affect each of your citizens in the same way. Usually the most marginalized, the poor, the unhoused will face more impacts than those who have better socioeconomic advantages. So it bears to say that when you design an assembly, that needs to be reflected in how you frame, how you present information, and how you deliberate on the question. So a couple of things that helped us at the center sort of conceptualize how we think about these issues. We see them as concentric circles. So again, the accessibility of space and process is really at the center. And I would say that is almost the part that is slightly easier to tackle. So this is where you would think of having your assembly in a space that is wheelchair accessible, that might have gender inclusive bathrooms, where you might think about having simultaneous interpretation, and so on and so forth. So that is the first part that you need to tackle. The second part around that is the inclusion of a good representation of folks. So again, we tend to use sortition models. A lot of the time we just go by demographic data. Overlaid on that, we can think about other elements. So again, Global Assembly was a good example. They overlaid attitudes around climate. You can also use different types of demographics to increase your capacity to think about, which generation might be affected more by climate. Is it a younger generation? Is it an older generation? So there are different ways to think about this representation of people. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The next piece around that, and I know we're going to talk about this in the small groups, but it's the remit and evidence that is presented. How are we framing the assembly? Each assembly tackles something different. They might propose new laws, they might propose recommendations, etc. But in any case, someone is going to frame that assembly. And how that framing is done is going to be very important in, again, tackling that notion that there are historic and ongoing disadvantages happening. The next layer around that gets a little more complex. And I think this is where it gets sometimes difficult for people to enter this conversation. But we also need to think about the institutional and organizational diversity around an assembly. Again, Global Assembly was a great example because they had this decentralized model that worked with a large number of other organizations across the globe. But in a lot of assemblies we've examined, you have a small organizing group. Usually the sponsor might be a government, or it might be a parliamentary group. And these groups tend to be very homogeneous in most of our countries. So even thinking about, is there any representation in that group? And then within the organizers, is there representation, or is there some self-reflection and some self-awareness so that you may compensate for the areas that you may have some some blind spots on. Again, I will take an example for myself. I'm an able-bodied woman. It's very hard for me to understand what the experience of a disabled person might be. So working with a disabled colleague might help me understand what I need to think about when planning and designing a space. So the final circle around this is what Azucena was hinting at in her presentation. It's the social equity piece. So again, thinking about how these assemblies interact with the greater political context. Do they allow for a real empowerment of the members participating? Do they allow for connections with other social movements that may advance what the assembly is trying to do? So again, this is a piece that can be difficult to discuss because there has often been the sense of purity around the assembly model being this very nice space that is disconnected and then allows us to really explore ideas in a beautiful way. But we know all these things aren't separated. So I would really encourage you to think about how we can connect these spaces. So I'll go quickly over a couple of ideas, pathways, I'm going to call them, to explore. Again, these are not prescriptions. These need to be contextualized to what you're doing, but they might really help us think through some of the things we can do. So valuing the contributions of the members, again, that's something that sometimes is done through compensation, like honorariums, but there are also other ways to value those contributions. So what might those look like? Planning early and proactively for contextual accessibility needs. Again, I'm going to take the example of folks with disabilities or with language differences. You want to build that into your budget early on and not run into the issue halfway through the design. In our interviews that we did with a lot of folks who had participated in assemblies or who were designers, we found that the use of storytelling and the welcoming of emotion was something that was often missing. Information tends to be presented in a very objective way, or as we would say, and tends to ignore the fact that some of these climate issues have deep emotional implications for people, and people make meaning of climate in different ways. So using storytelling, welcoming the use of emotion and the expression of emotion can really support, again, that notion of equity for folks. Creating spaces to build relationship between members. This is something we're discovering right now in our work, and I think needs to be expanded. But how do you enable participants to also build their own capacity between each other? That's something that is not often talked about. Again, working with community organizations to build capacity for deliberation. The Global Assembly was an example of that, so I won't go into too much detail. And then another thing is to think about what sequential deliberation might look like. The assembly model was interesting in that you had these community deliberations that were complementing the deliberations of the assembly itself. Other models have been used where we've had disadvantaged groups do their own mini assemblies to prepare a member to then participate in another assembly. This is still very experimental right now and requires like bigger budgets and a lot of investment, but in some cases it might be interesting to explore if you really want to highlight the experience of certain groups on certain types of issues that are tackled within assemblies. And then finally, reflecting on how we use time in assembly processes. And again, I'll point to what Azucena and Claire just mentioned around at what time are the assembly meetings happening? How much time are we allocating for reading resources or deliberating? And this notion of time is, again, very Western, tends to be very colonial. And if we're trying to decolonize these processes, the use of time is something we need to reflect on. Again, I'm not giving you a lot of answers here, more pathways to explore. So when it comes to diversity of folks, again, one of the things we point to is the use of disaggregated data, if you can, when you're looking at a population. This is a new area of demographics. I know it's not available everywhere, but if you have access to disaggregated data, it enables you to understand the internal diversity of different parts of the population. And as Azucena mentioned, this allows you to understand the intersections of experiences they may be having. One question that we don't have answered yet, but I want to explore with folks here is the idea of oversampling in some categories. I've talked to a lot of practitioners on this side of the Atlantic, and there's definitely different schools of thought around oversampling. Some think it might create a legitimacy problem for an assembly. Others think it's necessary to oversample to, again, acknowledge that some groups are facing larger impacts. It also avoids tokenizing. If you have just one disabled person or one Indigenous person present in your assembly, it's difficult for them to reflect on the entirety of the experiences that their group may face. So again, sometimes it might mean determining a threshold at which you want to have these numbers go up to. So something to explore here and to discuss. I would encourage folks to use frameworks to really understand this intersection of experiences and identity that Azucena was mentioning. Canada has the gender-based analysis plus model framework that is being used. That model is now being extended and is used in policy analysis very often and helps understand the assumptions that we bring and how we might be missing certain populations or certain groups of people when we're determining who we need to talk to. Again, overlaying different frames over demographics, whether it's attitudes, whether it's information people have or impacts they're facing, that can also help. I would also encourage people to think about the supports you bring into an assembly, whether it's mental health supports or anti-racism training. Even for facilitators facilitating assemblies, it can be very easy to miss something that is being said by a participant that may negatively impact another participant. Again, that's an area in facilitation that is being developed today, and I think there's great hope in using that a lot better. And then spending really time co-creating those community guidelines. Again, oftentimes the guidelines we use are very Western, they're modeled in a certain way of thinking, and expanding that to co-create them with participants really enables them to gain that agency and feel ownership over the process. I'm going to talk a little bit about the evidence that's presented. Again, I won't repeat what Azucena said, but thinking about those intersections of experiences, what impacts are happening in that particular community that you're targeting with the assembly. Understanding how communities frame an issue. And I'll give a quick example here. I work with a lot of populations in the Arctic, and they tend not to talk about climate change. So when we use the framing of climate change, it may create a disconnect for them with how they make meaning of the issue. So we talk about changes in the ice. What are the changes in the sea ice and how is that impacting your community? And that helps them make meaning of climate. So again, thinking about how communities frame the issue, it's really, really important to help them understand what we're trying to do. And then really considering who designed the remit, who framed the remit, and was that done in a democratic way itself? And these points, in some cases it is, in some cases it's not. And really, really, again, thinking about who's providing the evidence, and does it really accurately reflect those differentiated impacts? So if you have experts or community members presenting evidence, how are you allowing to present that evidence? Is it all written? Is it videos? Is it testimonies? Are they allowed to bring emotion into that or storytelling? So again, some pathways there. Around the institutional diversity, I won't go into too much detail here, but again, really encouraged to think about how do you recruit, retain staff that is diverse, and then really engaging in reflections around our own positions. What is the power that we hold? What is the advantage that we hold? How does that create tunnel vision in some cases for many of us that prevents us from seeing how these things affect others? And then really thinking about walking the talk. So if we're going to be inclusive in the climate assemblies, are we also being inclusive and equitable in our own organizations? And then finally, really thinking about how we share power with other parts of the polity. Again, recognizing that that power, that agency is different for different groups. And then finally, I would say discourse representation is important. This is something we actually talked about in our democracy group in North America a lot. Some discourses tend to be more represented, others tend to be ignored. So how are we making sure there's some balance there? And then really developing communities of practice like Knoca. So I think this is an amazing space to do this. And then finally, how do we connect the micro to the macro? Again, this is something that's being explored by many of our political science colleagues, but really finding ways to have those collaborative engagements with other parts of the system. So whether we're connecting with groups, for example, that are advocating in different positions around these issues, political parties, social movements, other practitioners, but also how we build the capacity of the members themselves to become policy advocates, to become communicators, to be able to take this work on further. And then finally, how do we build the capacity of decision makers to use deliberative spaces? And I know we have some amazing colleagues like Rebecca Willis who've done quite a bit of work on that. So I encourage people to think about these things. I'm going to stop there because that was very fast and a lot of information in one go, but really want to thank everybody for the time, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to bring, that was absolutely fantastic, Elodie, thank you, and really complemented what Claire and Azucena were talking about. I think we're going to bring Elodie, Claire and Azucena into this space for the next 5 or 10 minutes and just pick up any specific questions. And I was going to abuse my position as chair to ask a few things, but actually we haven't got a huge amount of time. There's a couple of questions come in that, and I think Azucena, you set everybody off with this word of deparochialization. It's like obviously today's word. Do you want to just try in a couple of minutes to try and say what you were talking about, and we can, maybe the four of us can try and think through what this might mean. What
yeah, so I actually used it to be less controversial, and then to basically not say decolonizing. No, I mean, I was just trying to, like, you know, put it in, yeah. I felt it was more practitioner oriented in a way, that word, but maybe it was a bad idea. But no, I mean, like, the idea was to basically, this is a very hard question to answer in just like 1 minute, but I think that if we think about decolonizing and somehow like decentering from kind of like very Western based ideals that are behind deliberative democracy, I think it would really help us to somehow address some of the failures also of dominant design features within deliberative mini publics. So for instance, this whole idea of like how without going into the history of why this is connected to process of enlightenment and imperialism, but I think that ideas such as like embedding processes in the nation state, when the nation state is such a violent concept in its inception, or the idea of so when you do randomized selection, you need to kind of like account for certain socio-demographic factors in society. And then this comes from a very strong colonial tradition of basically classifying populations and governance through the classification of these populations, or ideas of expert knowledge. So it's like what knowledge is valid and how in somehow the ongoing colonial structures in which we live, these ideas of whose knowledge is valid, whose knowledge is not valid, whose experience is not considered knowledge, are still very present. So how do we somehow deal with that? I don't know if this is a satisfying answer.
No, it makes sense. I think sometimes we get a bit lost in the debates about theory. And I'm just thinking about, because I think actually on a personal level, and this may be controversial, that I think you can separate deliberative democracy as a theory and what's happening in deliberative mini publics. I think they've been connected, but they're not necessarily the same thing. But the case is that most deliberative mini publics have been, the methodology has been developed within a Western framework, a way of thinking about deliberation and privileging particular ways of interacting, particular forms of knowledge provision, etc. So even if we don't go into the whether or not deliberative democracy as a theory is problematic, but actually look at the practice itself, it strikes me that there's a lot to learn from the practices of other places about how what they call deliberation or dialogue, etc., takes place. That we bring a bunch of assumptions in from our own sort of geographical, historical, and political backgrounds, and maybe miss stuff. So regardless of whether we want to debate about deliberative democracy as a theory, it strikes me that actually there are different ways of doing dialogue that we would do well to be open to. Elodie, you looked as though you were nodding. Is that because I haven't made a mistake? That wasn't too bad a response.
No, I have to agree with what you just said. I think it is about rethinking the models that we use even for communication. And when we think about the assembly model, I think an interesting conversation I had with a few people was, I'd really like to participate in something like this, but the information is always so sterile. That was the term the person used. And they said, I can't relate to that because it doesn't interact with my own experience of climate change. And this person was an Indigenous elder from the North, and they mentioned to me, I would rather sit around and we all shared stories of how climate is impacting our daily lives as hunters, as fishermen, as people on the land, and then use that as the basis for the discussion rather than have people present graphs and figures and numbers to us. And it was very interesting because they wanted to participate, but the way the information was presented was just a turnoff. And they were thinking, are there other ways we could have this discussion that was considered an important discussion? And that's just one example, but I think there are many other people who also have criticisms in the sense that if you come from certain marginalized groups, you've also had an experience of being asked questions, but those questions then being turned back against you. So we have a colleague here in Canada who studied environmental racism in Canada, and she reflects on the experiences of, for example, Black Canadians in certain areas of Canada being engaged on where to locate certain industries, and then that being used to actually precisely locate the industry where people said we don't want it. So again, when you have the compounding disadvantage of already being a marginalized group, having that fear that if you participate in this sort of assembly, then that is going to be used against you. That's something we tend to ignore.
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, I'm realizing, and we actually want to make sure we have time for the breakout. So I'm just trying to figure out what we're going to do. While we're thinking about that, Claire, I think you may, I wonder whether you can give us a little bit of insight into the challenge. You had a wisdom and knowledge council group, I think you called it, and I've heard from discussions in the past about that there was that you found it really challenging to kind of like try and do this practically. Is that right?
Yeah, so I mentioned the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee, which was one of the two advisory groups that helped us shape the process. And we had two original nations wisdom keepers represented there. So they informed, the learning, but I think we still didn't manage to fully embrace the potential. And we were very aware that the content of the learning phase was very written material heavy. If you look on the website, the information booklet is really dense, and it was coming from a place of acknowledging we needed to share data that was grounded in evidence and IPCC data and all of this. So we tried to make it as accessible as possible, but it was still very, very complex. Although I think the research is showing that people appreciated that as a supporting tool. But the key point I wanted to make was acknowledging the point Elodie was making about lived experience. So the assembly members were offered to be part actually of the experience sharing, and they shared their lived experience as part of the learning phase. So if you go on the Global Assembly website, you'll see all the list of speakers, and some of them are the Assembly members themselves, because they had the knowledge that we felt was needed. So all of them had the opportunity to share their lived experience if they wanted, as recorded statements. And you will see that these points around, what's knowledge, what's evidence. One of the Assembly members from Pakistan shared original understanding of climate change as God's will, and what happened as a result of taking part of the Assembly. So that's I think one thing I wanted to highlight is that we try. There are other ways we try to mitigate against the Western bias, but we didn't fully succeed.
No, I think it's a really interesting issue about trying to figure out what it means as well. I don't think Elodie or Azucena are saying, "Oh, we have the answers to your problem." It's actually the very fact you tried to do that and we learned something from it is really critical. I'm just going to take a couple of comments and then I'm going to lead it into the breakouts, and we'll have more time to talk about this. The first one was from Tila, and it's really difficult to talk about someone who's not in the room, but we will do anyway, and that's Marcin. And Marcin has been heard to say apparently that we shouldn't think about trying to use assemblies as the cure for all of existing sort of ethnic and racial problems that we've got, which is but then at the same time says we should think about oversampling, which is really kind of interesting. But there is it is, I think, a really interesting point that there's only so much you can do with an assembly, that actually we cannot resolve the whole of all of these problems with an assembly. It's trying to figure out what that is. And the other was a comment from Oliver, and about I'm sorry, Oliver, we won't have time to go. This about making sortition more of an accessible practice, particularly in more resource constrained context. And what's really interesting is, Elodie, your kind of comment about using this kind of intricate data in order to be much more sensitive can run against the challenge of trying to do this kind of work in places where they haven't got the resources to do, or we haven't got the resources to do. So I think what's really not interesting about this is how tensions can come in from different angles and point us in completely different directions. Is that fair?
I think both of those questions point to that, like, what are those tensions that we have to contend with as practitioners? And again, that's why I feel at the center, we don't want to make prescriptions like you should be using disaggregated data, but instead say, if you have the possibility, that may enhance your process. And again, it's all contextual. If you are in an area that has a highly homogeneous population, you may not need to use disaggregated data. But if you're working, say, on a city assembly where you have a highly diverse group, then you may need that disaggregated data. And again, if you are working in a context where it is available, why not use it? So again, a lot of this is contextual. And I think, again, it's more interesting to see how practitioners are trying and using some of these tools and what are they learning using them.
Okay, on that note, Claire, Azucena, Elodie, thank you so much for your presentations. I know a few people have had to leave because they couldn't stick around for the 2 hours, and I've already thanked you in the chat. But it was really informative, insightful. What we'd like to do now for the next half an hour or so is to put people into breakout groups where we can talk about these issues more extensively. And particularly, we're asking people to think about the ways in which key elements of climate assembly practice might be improved to enhance inclusion and equity. This could be, for example, in relation to commissioning, framing, organization, governance, recruitment, learning deliberation, collective decision making, and broader questions of impact on the social and political processes. And we're kind of interested about where you think we need to be focusing most attention. And of course, there are people in this room who have been doing really interesting work. So please bring in your experience to that discussion. And also, the second question is always the same. What should we be doing as the Knowledge Network? What should Knoca be doing to try and take forward these practices, to take forward these kinds of discussions? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to break you out into 3 or 4 smaller groups to talk about these things until about, I think everybody is back. I hope you've had a positive session. I know that some of the people were really unhappy about being dragged back into the main space, but that's what happens with these workshops. What I'd like to do is just to get a sense of what the priority areas were from each group, and maybe I'll pull back the people from the panel and Alina as well, who are running it. So maybe I think Elodie and Claire were in the same groups. Is Elodie and Claire, do you want to come back into this main space and just give us a short report back about the themes that you think were most critical from your group?
I'm happy to start with the first topic we tackled, and maybe Elodie can build on that. But the first topic was related to sortition and questions of legitimacy of who's basically in the room deliberating, and the question of, you know, oversampling with different groups, and examples that were shared, for instance, were examples in Sweden of Sami communities being, obviously, in the case of climate change, being very highly impacted by climate change. And what Tim was saying from Sweden is that they would be very unlikely represented in an assembly, or people would identify very rarely as Sami. So yeah, that was one of the first discussion around, you know, who's in the room, basically. I don't know if I did justice to that, but.
Okay. Anything you want to add in, Elodie, that were particularly striking for you?
We also talked about this tension between the power that is in the room. So some examples were shared around assemblies where politicians were brought in, and how does that affect, for example, the participants themselves? Will they feel an imposter syndrome in participating in these sort of hybrid models? So what other hybrid models could we think about, and is that useful? Or again, do we think more about diversifying the pool of participants rather than bringing more people who have a lot of agency and power already? So lots of tensions there as well to explore, I think. And then I think the last topic we were just starting to get into, and then we were whisked back, was how we think about our facilitation, and what does decolonizing facilitation look like? We're just getting into that, so maybe topic for another discussion later on.
No, well, the challenge with this area is that each of these issues is a challenge in its own right. I think one of the things we maybe need to think with the wider community is which of these areas do we particularly want to focus on, and there are, you know, facilitation networks that may be better at doing that. I don't know, but Knoca could definitely think about doing that. Do you have any sense yourself? Maybe you didn't have enough time to talk about this, Claire and Elodie, about where you think that we as a network could put most of our attention, put our attention in this area. Do you have any thoughts about that at all, or did you not everything?
Yeah, you can ECF could be funding a few years of worth of events, but I'm really interested in how trauma informs our work. And I know Mehr Demokratie, for instance, in Germany, has done really interesting work with a project called the Pocket Project, and it's with Thomas Hübel and trauma-informed practices, and they've released recently a report on democracy and trauma, which I can put the link into. And for me, this is it's bringing the discussion at the level of systemic issues, and you know, you could say it encompasses all the topics we're talking about, you know, decolonization, patriarchy, whiteness, privilege, all of it. So that would be interesting.
Okay, is this the new meta concept? Is it trauma is the kind of and Elodie, you've been working in this space for a long time, and obviously been running all sorts of workshops all over Canada and elsewhere. And I just wonder where you think, given the limited time and focus we have, where it could be best be focused, or is that an impossible question?
It is a bit of an impossible question, because I don't think we should, for me, it's not an either or conversation. It's a yes and what are the different things we should be looking at? Because I think all these things have to happen in conjunction. It's not just like, we can't just deal with sortition or just deal with facilitation. It's how do we deal with these things in conjunction? But I think the broader question for me is, again, how do we use these deliberative spaces as a way to connect with broader political contexts? And I think that's one that many of our colleagues are thinking about very deeply, and I'm extremely interested in that.
I think there's a really interesting issue there, which we've recently said. I don't know if you've seen it, Richard Youngs from Carnegie Europe produced a report recently about embedding assemblies, and he wasn't talking about embedding assemblies at the end with public administration, but actually up front. And one of his questions was, deliberative practitioners tend to want to see themselves as neutral, when actually their work is so far from neutral. It's not, and that actually we need to be much more explicit about some of the political agendas that are happening here, and that's really uncomfortable for some folk. So it's a really interesting kind of tension about aligning this kind of work, because I know for some people it's really important to be, inverted commas, depolitical.
Maybe that is the next workshop, the myth of neutrality. It's also a myth for facilitators themselves, right? We try to consider ourselves as impartial or neutral, but we very rarely are.
Yeah.
So maybe that's it, the myth of neutrality. Let's tackle that.
Stina, could you leave Claire and Elodie in, because we might just see if we've got they can do their emails while I'm talking to Azucena, but could you pull Azucena in as well? So someone just asked me about the this is watching the guy who's I'm just trying to find that link for the paper I just mentioned. Azucena, were there any themes that came out of your workshop that resonated or didn't, not your workshop, your breakout group, that resonated or were different from what you've heard from Claire and Elodie?
Well, something that came out was also this idea of representation, and somehow like the discussion about like representation not meaning inclusion and equality. So it's like, it's kind of like different things related, but also very different things. I think another thing that came out was this kind of like struggle with non-prescriptive kind of like approaches to it, which I think is something that it's tricky always, and somehow like what do we do with.
Can you clarify what you mean by non-prescriptive, Azucena?
So, not kind of like one solution fits all to like, if we do this, then this process is inclusive, or if we do this, then this process will be equitable, but kind of like, the moving parts. And I think Elodie like described it really well, like, kind of like all of the moving parts and context dependent situations that we find that somehow, again, kind of like address this somehow idea of like thinking or rethinking about the convening power and what to do with that, kind of like the governance of the convening power, the who is convening whom, and who wants to convene whom. So I think that's very important. And another thing that might be interesting to think about is the affected populations, especially when we talk about climate. So it's like, if we're talking about equity and inclusion in order to ensure that just transition, I think it would be also very interesting to talk about who will be affected by the recommendations or the implementation of the recommendations done by climate assemblies. And I think that will kind of like put us also like to deal with very difficult questions that are not very easily operationalized, in the sense that who is actually, who is deciding on certain responses and who will be affected by these responses, and what are kind of like more the most like, transnational dependencies that are going to emerge and put into evidence if we actually talk about that.
Yeah, no, that's really that makes a lot of sense. That's really helpful, Azucena. And can I just bring in and I've just been picked up by Oliver. He has to pick me up at least once every session about the difference between impartiality and neutrality. I think definitely Oliver is the person to talk to about that, and definitely will be dragged into this space kicking and screaming if we do something on facilitation. It is, by the way, something that Oliver has to do, and everything I do is pick me up on something, because it's really important. Can I just pull in Alina and Malta just for the last group, and just see if there's anything that that came out from that group?
Sure, we had a really interesting and rich discussion, so I'll just highlight, I think we focused potentially slightly on other aspects than the other groups. So we did talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion in the process of setting up the agenda. Some of that came through the panel discussion as well. And perhaps the idea of including members of the assembly already at the design stage, once they've accepted and shaping the organization. We talked about framing, and also actually the knowledge that is being picked up both as background material for the participants, but also throughout the assembly, and the need to consider potentially emotions, experimental knowledge, different types of knowledge more, and how the assembly is being prepared and also run, and more of a creative materials being used in the assembly itself, but also potentially in the outputs, considering whether we might want to go beyond just the written recommendations, but including stories, creative outputs of the participants as part of the assembly output and legacy. The other aspect was invitation of participants, and there were some ideas on perhaps investigating, interviewing the past assembly participants, but also surveying how participants got invited, and whether they would have accepted, but we'll get better response if they didn't just get the letter in the mail, but there might be local context, and particular communities might respond better to different types of invitations. And then how the materials are presented. And finally, we had some specific ideas on what Knoca might usefully consider doing. I think generally the debate like today, more debates clarifying the questions in the first instance, but also changing experiences, that was seen as a valuable place for us to be. But also some specific ideas, perhaps compiling and identifying very clearly what are the problems we're trying to solve, which is, again, I think some of the colleagues who presented today started that, and then cataloging the solutions in terms of how different assemblies have already tried to tackle some of those issues, and additional solutions that one might come up with. So that was suggested as a useful exercise for Knoca to consider. I don't know if I forgot
that's an agenda.
So other colleagues, feel free to jump if I forgot anything important that we touched upon, but I just say we had a really interesting discussion in our group.
So Malta, I feel you've been a bit of you've not got anything left to say, have you?
Not really. I think that covers most of the discussion. There was some sentiment that guidance was always a good idea, and that's but that's very general, I guess.
I think for me, just as a sort of there are a couple of takeaways for me. One is this issue of guidance. I'm very taken by what Elodie said, and what and Claire built up on this as well, which is there is no one right answer. And some of the guidance here might be as much about the questions that we're asking of ourselves, not necessarily do this, but at these points you need to be asking these kinds of questions, and these are the sorts of solutions that might present themselves, because it is possible that in one context doing this actually could be problematic. So I think that's maybe part of what we need to be doing is actually clarifying for ourselves what the key questions are that we should be asking, because I think we're still scratching around with some of that. And the other thing I think that I'll leave us with on this is a point that Azucena said in her presentation, which is thinking about what it means to design a climate assembly from the perspective of the most disadvantaged. And I think what we tend to do is to try and figure out, this is our model, how can we make it accessible, rather than perhaps sometimes thinking, should we be starting at this point? Should we actually be more thinking about what the experience and the needs are of disadvantaged people? And that feeds our design, rather than actually doing that as an add-on at the end. Well, I mean, I think I know what the answer to that is, but I think it's a really interesting question about trying to think what it means to design from the perspective of the most disadvantaged. And probably, you know, that sort of question, but it's not, and Elodie also said it's not all about design. Hello, Azucena's little one. Anyway, on that note, I would like to thank Claire, Azucena and Elodie for what were really wonderful provocations at the start and really interesting insights, and thank you for leading. And I'd like to thank Alina and Malta for stepping in and helping to do some of the facilitation. I am absolutely amazed that my voice has stood up for this, and I'm really pleased that I came and did this session. We will carry on doing this work. We have more events planned. We don't have them on the website at the moment. I don't think there's much in February. We're looking towards March. But I can tell you in advance that we're going to be launching a playbook, which Alina has been working on, a playbook for climate NGOs about how they engage, or how they can engage with climate assemblies and the different strategies they can take. Malta is leading a workshop on the selection and presentation of evidence, which I think may actually have an inclusion angle to it. I'm absolutely certain it will be, and questioning what kind of evidence, how, where, and when. We're going to be doing some work with Katie, who has worked at Katie Reid, who worked on the Scottish Climate Assembly, and most recently on the Biodiversity Assembly in Ireland. She's going to be doing a session on how do you engage children and young people in climate assemblies. And we're also going to have some learning calls around Poland and around Luxembourg. But most of all, we're going to, everyone, you didn't need to turn your camera off, Azucena. We're all going to wave at this point. I'd like to thank everybody for coming into this space with a real positivity and mutual respect. It's been a really excellent couple of hours, and I look forward to further conversations around these issues. So thank you, one and all. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.